This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I am your host, Sarah Blair, back again, and today is Darren Mooney we have on the docket. Darren.
Hello. How are things?
Hi.
How's life?
It's going great.
As well as can be expected. That always feels like a loaded question these days. How's it going? It's going as well as it can.
It's going. It is still going.
That is all we ask.
We're here. Thank goodness. Yes, exactly. So we're going to talk about the second part of the season 8 premiere, Without. Because last week it was Within, and this week it is Without.
I do like a good naming convention, I have to admit. One of those nice, it's easy to remember what this two-parter is. It's similar like to the season finale, which is Essence and Existence. It's like, yep, this is easy to... The only problem is I occasionally get the two mixed up. I'm like, which was Existence and Essence or Essence and Existence?
Yes, exactly. So this episode originally aired on the 12th of November in 2000. So 21 years ago. Can you believe we've made it this far?
To make us all feel very old.
Right? What is this world? As we mentioned, this is the second episode of the season, and it was written by Chris Carter with Stephen Maida and Jeffrey Bell listed as story editors.
Having joined, I believe, from Harsh Realm. I believe both of those writers began on Harsh Realm and then got kind of folded in to the X-Files writing staff on the 8th season. Because again, Carter is generally quite good about that. He tends to protect his people. He tends to if you work with Carter, you are kind of protected and guarded. He talked about when he moved the show to Los Angeles, helping to relocate the staff as best he could. And I think he's talked about one of the reasons why, and this is probably something we'll get into when we talk about season 8 as a whole, and maybe season 9 next year, is the idea that Carter was pretty much I am on the X-Files for as long as Gillian and David are because I made that promise to them. So I do like that Carter is you are my guys.
Yeah. And Jeffrey Bell, of course, wrote Goldberg Variation and Ranking, which I love. So those are fun episodes. And this was directed by Kim Manners. So along with the previous episode. Yeah, in this episode, Scully leads Skinner and Doggett to Arizona to protect child prodigy Gibson Praise from an alien bounty hunter disguised as the missing Mulder. Should we just dive right into it and do the scores first and then talk about what we think about the episode?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Let's do that. I
always forget because we get down into it and I'm so invested in the conversation, talking about what we think about the episode. I forget about the score. So tell me what would you rate this episode out of 10?
This is an easy 9 for me. I think Within is the same as well. I think I've talked on previous episodes about how much I love the 8th season of the X-Files. For me, if you were to take it as a whole season of television, it's probably my second, or at worst, my third favorite season of the X-Files. I think maybe the third season is pound for pound a better season of television. And I think maybe the 5th season kind of holds together, almost as well over the course of its run. I do think, obviously, that there are, say, higher highs in the 4th and 6th season, for example. I don't think the 8th season is anything as good as, say, Drive or, Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man or Home or anything like that. But I think that if you take this block of episodes, these 21 episodes, and watch them back to back, they watch remarkably well for a television show that was broadcast, as you point out, starting in late 2000 and ending in mid-2001, a long serialized story that is basically the story of the quest for Mulder, the idea of Scully's pregnancy, and more existentially, the question of what the X-Files is if it loses one or possibly both by the end of the season of its two leads. It's this wonderful kind of story that has this nice, clear 3-act structure across its 21 episodes. And the first act is obviously the stretch that we're in now, which is the search for Mulder, and then you have a short stretch where it's like the Doggett and Scully adventures, and then you have, as you get towards the end, kind of the idea of resolution of that. And I think the entire 8th season is a phenomenal accomplishment from a writing staff and production team who, and I know maybe this is a controversial opinion, but who last year kind of seemed like they were kind of shuffling, maybe a little bit without direction, maybe a little bit unsure what the future of the show was, maybe preparing to put the X-Files to rest and wrap it up and call it a day, whether to transition into film or just to step away and do other projects. And the 8th season is one of those things where Carter and everybody involved ended up doing this almost entirely by chance. It got recommissioned by Fox because it came out of Doug Herzog's one of the worst seasons of television of any major network in the history of American broadcast television, where all of the new shows, with the exception of Malcolm in the Middle, were cancelled, meaning that there was absolutely nothing on the slate. They literally could not afford to cancel the X-Files. At the same time, you had that lawsuit that, again, we discussed in the 7th season with, like, Duchovny suing Fox and naming Carter as kind of a conspirator involved in a desire to rob him of the royalties that he was owed, and announcing that he was done with the X-Files and he wanted to move on. And so, when the 8th season is commissioned, they go to Duchovny and they say, look, will you come back? And he says no. And they say, what if we give you lots of money? And he says, okay, but I'll only come back for 11 of these 21 episodes. And you look at that, and those are incredible constraints to impose on a show that, I know there are people who love the 7th season. There are episodes in the 7th season that I love and adore. I think X-Cops is as good a show as the X-Files ever produced. I think Requiem is a masterpiece. But I do think that in the 7th season, the show was a little bit shaky, a little bit uncertain of itself, maybe a little bit kind of unsure of what it wanted to be and where it was going. And I think that you look at all the constraints that were placed on the writing staff going into the 8th season, and it is remarkable how they all seem to focus and galvanize everything. And you ended up with a show or a season of television that I think, you mentioned now is 21 years old, 22 years old almost. You watch it today, and I think it looks a lot more, or feels a lot more modern than any of the other seasons of the show, ironically, including the 2 revival seasons, and ironically, including the 9th season that would follow. And I think that is an absolutely stunning accomplishment. And I think Without, which is the episode that we're talking about today, whether as part of the 2-parter Within, or on its own terms, is a major part of that, because this is an episode that feels arguably somewhat different from what the X-Files has kind of done with mythology episodes before. It's a lot more existential, it's a lot more introverted, it's a lot more, I think, emotive, a lot more, as the title Within suggests, a lot more internalized than the show had been to this point. It's a show that's an episode that is like explicitly more about the emotional journeys of the characters, and in particular Scully, I think, than it is about plot or resolution. It's more about telling the audience that the show is not only back, but the show knows where it's going, that you are in safe hands, that there is a plan and a purpose, and that there is a direction the show is heading that it maybe had been lacking in the previous year. And I think that is remarkable. I think it's remarkable, as I point out, like, given where the show was last year, but in the context of television in November 2000, I think it's remarkable. And I think watch today, it's remarkable. So yeah, I think, not sounding very verbose, but I think that Without is a remarkable piece of television. So yeah, a solid 9 for me.
Excellent. Well,
what about yourself?
I am excited this season because I feel like a lot of the X-casters, a lot of the people in our group here really love this season. So I'm excited for you guys to be able to convince me to love this season.
Oh, okay. So I'm guessing we're not going with a 9.
Yeah. So I think I would probably rate it maybe like a 7.5, 7.9. So I know that's low, but I need convincing, Darren. That's what we're doing here today. So
I am here to bully you until you like Without. That is my job here, apparently.
I am here to listen to why you love this X-Files episode so much and to enjoy that you enjoy it. So
Fantastic. I feel like I'm going to terrorize you for the next hour of this podcast. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Actually, no, I think it's really good because that's one of the things I love about the X-Cast is that hearing other people's perspectives and getting the points of view and all that just really helps me see things in a new light. So I'm hoping that the journey of season 8 will be a character arc for me.
You'll grow and develop over the course of it and come out the other end. Whether, as an alien-human hybrid super soldier who has been replaced by a version of Sarah who loves season 8, that's... Or more hopefully and optimistically, perhaps like one of the... And again, I think are we assuming that audiences have seen this season before? Like, so can I give like spoilers? Or no, let's not give spoilers. But maybe imagining you're taking a journey similar to, say, one of the two leads of this show, who maybe comes to a more mature realization of who they are, where they are, and kind of what they want from the future. Perhaps. So one of those two options.
Yes, or at least better acquainted with the season, because this is not a season that I watch. I just don't. So okay. I'm hoping to at least learn some new things. Okay, so the IMDb score for this episode is 8.4 out of 2,543 votes at the time of recording. This is the same rating as Within, and about the same amount of votes, pretty close, like really close actually. So I feel like if people watched Without and Within, and they both voted, so and this is the highest rated episode of the season. Do you know? Can you guess?
Highest rated episode of this season, of the 8th season. Okay, my personal favorite, I think the strongest episode is This Is Not Happening, but I don't know if the internet feels the same way. So I'm gonna just like take a swing and say it's not Badla. That's gonna be my other guess. So those are the two starting points that I have in making this supposition. Roadrunners is also a contender, but I think that's maybe too icky. I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna say it's the finale. I'm gonna say it's Existence.
Nailed it.
What?
Yes.
I never do this. I'm really proud. This is like this going on the Hall of Fame. It's like Darren finally understands the IMDb. But I think that and I think that like, maybe there's an argument to be made that that's reflective of what the season is, because the season is heavily serialized. It is arguably a single story. I made the argument that it has 3 acts. So I think that with that structure, a lot of people who watch it tend to treat the payoff, the finale, as like the point of culmination for the whole season. So I guess that kind of maybe reflects that argument, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yes. And can you guess which ones are at the bottom?
Which ones? Ooh, is there a joint?
It's a tie
There's
for
a tie.
worst episode. I should say worst rated episode.
Okay. So I'm going to take the easy one here, and I'm going to take a swing at Badla. Is Badla one of them?
No.
What?
Mm-mm.
Okay, fine. All right, so Salvage.
Yes, that's one of them.
Okay, Salvage is one, and that means it's probably one of that middle stretch. I suspect it's possibly one of that middle stretch.
Yes.
So does that mean?
Hot.
Oh, fantastic!
Hot. Very hot.
Okay. So yeah, I think the second act of the season is probably the weakest, the bit where they're just doing Doggett and Scully stories. So okay, so it's not Badla. I know it's Salvage. So is it Medusa or is it Surekill? Surekill.
Yes.
I'm gonna go with Surekill.
Nailed it.
Fantastic.
It's a fun game.
It is. I do feel like I miss with Badla. I'm really like, tell me, like, okay, not to spoil Badla in terms of ranking, but is Badla in the range, or does Badla have a really strong following on IMDb that I did not anticipate?
I just browsed through. I don't remember the exact number of Badla, but I can look it up. But yeah, I think Badla is one that you either like a lot or don't like a lot. It's like
we should come back and we should do Badla. We should have the opposite effect where Sarah just convinces me that Badla is a work of genius.
I don't know about that.
But it's too late. We made the pitch.
All right. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to dive into this season. So yeah, we may as well just dive into the whole episode while we're diving into the rest of the season. So let's do that. Do you want to, let's talk about, I keep getting them mixed up, Within or Without.
It is a very it is very much a confusing naming convention.
All right, let's dive in and talk about Without. Okay, Without, Darren. How do we? Let's just talk about the teaser. It's very short, right?
Yes.
But I don't think it needs to be long because it's part of a two-parter. It's just like this.
It is,
quick little thing.
And I kind of have a suspicion, looking at the episode, that the original plan was for the teaser to be the confrontation between Mulder and Doggett. Because if you watch the episode, the actual also starring credits begin after that shot of Mulder on the ground opening his eyes, which would imply that maybe it was moved quite late in the shooting schedule, or quite late in, the post-production schedule. So it was like, okay, we were going to open with that confrontation between Doggett and Mulder, and for whatever reason, we didn't feel like Mulder opening his eyes at the bottom of the cliff was a big enough cliffhanger. And I kind of actually really like this opening bit, because one of the things that I like about Within and Without, and I suspect they are things that people who do not like the episode actively hate about them, but I quite like that they're lyrical in a way. We talked before about how a lot of Carter's prose is very purple, and he's very prone to voiceovers and shots of characters wandering through open spaces as they contemplate the nature of the world. And there's a lot of that in Within and Without, and what I really like about both is that Carter kind of resists the urge to get overly verbose. There is voiceover, there is monologue. Obviously, Scully gets a lot of conversation here at the start, but as you point out, it's very short. But you get this sense of loneliness and longing in these episodes, which is really profound and really personal. And I think what I do like about both episodes, and I apologize to everybody who talked about Within last week. I'm not going to talk over them. But I think that if you look at the two of them together, they're remarkably quiet. And I mean, obviously you have Mark Snow's score and that kind of we are near chant that happens, which I love. I think it's one of Snow's best kind of musical motifs. But what really struck me rewatching it is how much of these episodes are quiet. How much of these episodes are Gillian Anderson standing in a space, contemplating how lonely and how isolated she is. And I mean, here in Without, you have kind of a teaser that reminds me a bit of... And obviously later on in the episode you have the sequence of Scully wandering through the desert. It reminds me a lot of the opening to Emily from the 5th season, where you have a much more impressionistic or expressionistic kind of take on that, where Scully is wandering through a desert and giving this voiceover. But it underscores this idea. And again, I think that, and again, to tie back to just a general comment about the 8th season marks something of a return by the show to horror, and a lot of that horror is body horror, and we'll talk about that maybe later on as well, because that's obviously tied to the themes of the season. But it's also a use of darkness, and there's a lot more night shooting here than I recall there being on the 6th or even the 7th seasons as well. And I think that the use of the desert here in Within and Without is probably the best use of desert, or the best use of the kind of Los Angeles, California, Nevada desert that the show has done since Drive in the early 6th season. Because it really does underscore the idea that Scully is truly alone, that she is missing this vital part of herself, and the show is missing this vital part of itself, and it is wandering through the wasteland. And again, I think, and again, this is one of the things where I'm talking, and people who don't like this seasons are letting their eyes glaze over and are being like, what the hell is he talking about? He's disappearing up various parts of his anatomy. But I really love that the show in the 8th season becomes more introspective, perhaps. And it's notable, and again, this is one of the things where I freely put my hands up and say I'm probably being too generous or reading too much into it. But you have the opening and closing two-parter both have this wonderful naming convention where the first episode is about something internal. It's about something within yourself. It's about introspection. And the second episode is about how that relates to the larger world, the title of the second episode. So Within, which is about obviously looking within yourself, and the idea the truth is within you, and you are an entity yourself alone in the world, like Scully is without Mulder. And then without, which is this wonderful title, which is like, not only it's an opposite of within, without is external outside, but it's also the idea that Scully is without Mulder for the first time. And you have the finale, which is essence, which is this fundamental, self, this idea of what you are at your core. And then you have existence, which is this idea of the life that you live. And I think what I really respond to about the 8th season is that you have this very real divide between the two, and this theme of vice. Because obviously, throughout the show's history, up until this point, so from the first season through to the 7th, the show has returned time and time again to the theme of hybridization. The idea that us and them, the outside and the inside, are things that exist and commingle, and that's reflected in themes like, obviously, the colonization plot, where alien-human hybrids are a major part of that. It's reflected in the conspiracy, where the real threat isn't necessarily the colonists themselves, but the human collaborators working within them, so that there's, this idea that we are our own worst enemy. It's not an external force. And then arguably with Mulder and Scully themselves, because they are, over the course of those 7 seasons, they become almost two sides of the same person. They become so intermingled with one another that it's impossible to separate them. They are a hybrid, for lack of a better word. And what I really like thematically about the 8th season is that immediately the show understands that when you lose Mulder, when you take away like the core aspect of the show, you end up with this much firmer delineation between self and other, between Scully and the rest of the world. Because Scully doesn't have Mulder anymore. She is on her own, and she is, forced to both look within herself and forced to live without Mulder. And I think the way in which Within and Without use the desert setting, in a way that kind of evokes, the if you want to be pretentious, Brilliard's Desert of the Real, The Matrix, Desert of the Real, and then, you have Zizek's kind of quote from the 2002 book as well. But the idea that she is living in a world without Mulder that is just a wasteland, that is this empty, barren landscape, which is full of illusions and kind of wilderness and nothing. And I find that really affecting as far as visual storytelling goes. Sorry, that's a very long and rambly answer when talking about the opening sequence and the idea that you have this empty, huge empty space, and the idea that Mulder could be floating right there in front of her, but remains just out of reach. But I think, if you will allow me to be a little bit pretentious, that's something I really respond to in these 2 episodes and in the season as a whole.
Well, I think there are definitely some things worth unpacking there, especially just the sheer heavy amount of pure angst in this episode.
Yes.
It's the angstiest angst.
Yes, and it's glorious.
Yeah.
Feed me it.
Yeah. So, and I mean, the fan fiction, the angsty fan fiction, man, I just soaked that up. It was just, it was so delightful way back when, 21 years ago and beyond, 25, 23 years ago. And I wonder if that's maybe what I find more difficult to watch now, because it and like you said, the introspection, the existentialism, and all of that, I feel like the world is such a changed place these days.
Yeah.
And when I go to be entertained and watch shows, especially the X-Files, I want to escape the darkness and the angst.
Yeah. That's entirely fair.
Yeah.
And I think it's notable that the show drops off a cliff in the 9th season at a point where, the 90s end very definitively on September the 11th. And I think Carter himself has made the point that the audience drop on the 9th season wasn't after the premiere. It isn't like people watched, whatever we can say about Nothing Important Happened Today and the quality of that as an episode of television. Carter's argument is, and I think it's a convincing one, is that it isn't that people tune into Nothing Important Happened Today 1 and decided, no, this isn't for me. Carter's argument is that something happened in the space between, the high ratings for Existence and the low ratings for Nothing Important Happened Today Part 1 that just said, people don't want this right now. So I think you're being entirely reasonable and fair. I think that's a fair criticism.
Yeah. And also, can we just talk about like the literal cliffhanger? I mean, could we get more literal? On a cliff, I don't know.
With helicopter shots as well. Like, again, Manners directs the hell out of this
right?
stuff. I really like, you get these nice wide epic shots. And again, it feels very much like the show is, the term cinematic is kind of overused these days, and all television looks like this now. But I remember, like, one of the things I always loved about watching the X-Files in the 90s was that it was, like, it looked properly cinematic. And here I think 2000 is around the point where obviously like DVDs are kicking off,
right.
HD televisions are kind of coming into fashion, widescreen televisions are coming into fashion, and like those shots of like Doggett and Mulder doing the standoff on the mountain with the helicopter whirling around them, like really do feel like they're emblematic of, this is, television is now big and epic. Also, we have Robert Patrick, who is arguably a movie star these days, and that like his most famous role remains Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So it's like, this is, television is properly cinematic. I think these episodes look great.
Yes, absolutely. And just the sweeping desert and like what you said about the expanse, and like it feels like taking a very deep, intense breath. Like, there's a lot of breathing room here. So. And
a lot of silence as well, actually. Like again, and we mentioned Mark's no score, but, like, there's a lot of moments here where, like, you'll just get the ambient sound of the desert. Like, there's a confrontation, I think, between Doggett and Skinner, where Skinner's explaining that Kirsch is, like, setting up Doggett, like, as a political rival, that he wants to kind of, like, literally kind of bag him down with this stuff and get rid of a potential threat to him. But, like, you can, if you watch that sequence, there's no ambient music under it. You can just hear the crickets chirping in the night. And it really does underscore the fact that they are in the middle of nowhere. Like there's nothing around them.
Yeah. It's
but
amazing.
Wilderness.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about Skinner Scully team up. The Skinner and Scully, Skin Man. And...
This is why I thought it would rate higher for you, Sarah. I would have thought that you'd be like, if only that damn Doggett didn't get in the way. He's like the third wheel in a romantic comedy.
Let's talk about how Skinner is like all of those points for me.
I can buy that. Like, I mean, I do think that there is, and again, you probably talked about this last week, but like the way in which the show understands that the audience is going to be hostile to Doggett. And like, I should be clear up front, I love Doggett. I mean, I love Mulder and Scully more because they are the essence of the show, but I think Doggett is a fantastic character. But I love that the show understands from the outset that as much as I love Robert Patrick and as much as Doggett is a great character, nobody is tuning into Within and Without to watch the Doggett show. And I kind of love how, obviously last week you have the sequence where Scully throws water in his face, and they've talked about how that was very much like she was doing it for the fans and to like let the fans know that this wasn't going to turn into a Doggett and Pony show. But also you have the idea that like Skinner steps up as well, and it happens throughout the season as well. Like the season makes a big deal, particularly say via Negativa, of giving Skinner more material to play and letting him become a more active participant in the narrative, where he's not just say doing his own episodes like Avatar or SR. Is it 891 691? I can't remember what Senate resolution it is. But like those 819. Damn it. But I was so close. But it like. Those episodes were like Skinner episodes and they were separate. In the 8th season, you get a lot more of Skinner is an active participant in the plot, and he's an equal in some ways to Doggett and Scully. And I think that's an important choice the show makes, because it doesn't try to ignore the absence of Mulder or Duchovny. It doesn't try to like slot Doggett into the role of Mulder or Duchovny. It doesn't treat him as a replacement. And like you look back at like Entertainment Weekly reviews, and I think that like it's very clear that like Carter was like on message with everybody talking to a reporter. We are not replacing Duchovny with Patrick. Make that point in whatever interview you're giving. And I think that allocating Skinner or using Skinner in the way the 8th season does is very clever, because it means that Doggett doesn't feel like they're just popping him into the co-lead role. It feels like the show understands that A, replacing Mulder is impossible, and B, filling the plot and narrative void left by Mulder is something that you can't allocate to a single character because the audience will hate that character with the passion of burning sun. So you have, like, in order to do all the stuff that Mulder used to do, you have to have Scully trying to do Mulder. You have to have Doggett, like, working as Scully's partner. And you have to have Skinner, like, actively participating in the narrative. And I think that's a very clever structural choice. Also, I like Skinner as well.
Well, I do think it's interesting to see the shift because, like you said, you know, they're taking on kind of these new roles, but it's almost like Scully takes on Mulder's believer role, and then Skinner shifts into her role as the somewhat believer skeptic, or the voice of reason, shall we say. Yeah. And then Doggett comes in as the full-on skeptic that we have to convince. I think that's an interesting shift of, you know, character
dynamics,
right.
and I think it helps that, like, you've had 7 seasons of the classic dynamic. So, and again, one of the big criticisms of the show, and I don't think it's entirely fair, but one that was, like, constantly parroted in the media, was the idea that, well, look, Scully's been wrong for 7 consecutive years. At what point does she kind of, like, evolve and move on and realize that she's wrong? And I think that's an approach that somewhat simplifies the character of Scully. I think that as the show goes on, Scully becomes a much more nuanced character in the kind of skeptic role. But I do think that, as you point out, like, pushing the characters into new dynamics is something that makes the show, like, feel fresh and vital and kind of interesting and, like, pumps blood into the 8th season of a show that at this point has been running for, you know, well over 100 episodes. And I think that it also works because none of the one of the things that I find really fascinating about the 8th season as a whole, and it's obvious without as well, but it's obvious within this episode as well, is the fact that none of the characters are comfortable being pushed into these roles. All these characters aren't jumping up and down to go, finally it's my turn in the spotlight. They're all going, this isn't something that I know how to do, and this isn't necessarily something that I want to do. And so you have this wonderful, again, dramatic tension, which underscores the fact that the show, like, I think one of the smartest things about the 8th season is that it doesn't pretend that the X-Files can work without Mulder. And I think that's maybe the big difference why I would argue, personally, that the 8th season works so much better than the 9th. The 8th season understands that the X-Files without Mulder is not a viable concept. And so it is built around the idea that we don't have Mulder, and that is a serious structural problem that we need to be dealing with within the actual narrative and story that we're telling. So everybody feels reluctant to, like, everybody feels uncomfortable that they've been moved around the board to fill this negative space that's left, which I think is a very clever thematic thing. But I also think that it helps that it gives the actors a lot of material to play that makes them, like, really compelling and really interesting. I think Anderson's always phenomenal. There's a reason that she won an Emmy for playing Scully. I think she's really great in the 8th season, where you can see that she's not comfortable stepping into the Mulder role. It's something that she's doing, you know, in part perhaps to honor him, perhaps to keep his life work going, and perhaps because she understands that that's the way that she can get him back. But it's not something that she, like, is excited or gleeful or happy or comfortable with, and I think that makes the character interesting. You have Doggett, who's, like, you know, clearly not comfortable working on the X-Files, but understands that he's a professional and it's his job, and he promised he would find Mulder, so he's going to try and find a way to make that work. And I think, you know, one of the things that I really like about the show is that it makes Doggett basically a decent person, where, like, when he's skeptical, he's well aware of the fact that he's being a bit of an asshole and he doesn't want to be. I think, like, one of the things that I really like about the first stretch of the season is that, like, Doggett's character arc is, I have no idea what's going on. Scully does, so I will mostly just listen to her. And I think, like, with Skinner, you have this kind of tension as well, where Skinner, like, you know, this question of, like, will Skinner lie? Like, will Skinner compromise Mulder in order to continue working so he can help find Mulder? That gives you this really compelling thing to play with Skinner, where, like, in the past, the tension with Skinner's character has always been, and again, the show at this stage has been running 7 seasons, and I think we remarked in the 6th season, I think you and I maybe talking about an episode, talked about how kind of tired it was that the show kept going back to the can we trust Skinner card. Like, the show was like always pinch hitting with, but what if Mulder and Scully can't trust Skinner? And I think that it's really cool that this episode, this two-parter that opens the season, and this episode in particular, like, kind of put a nice little screwball kind of curveball on that, where they say, what if Skinner has to betray Mulder in order to help him? What if Skinner has to lie about what he saw? What if Skinner wants to testify to everything that he saw? He wants to tell the truth. He wants to honor Mulder. He wants to be a decent person, and he wants to take that responsibility because he does feel that responsibility. He's basically Mulder's surrogate dad, and he wants to kind of like accept his responsibility for everything that happened. But what if he can't do that? What if he has to lie? What if he has to, pretend that he didn't see what he saw in Requiem in order to, like, allow the FBI to continue to look for Mulder, allow him to continue to be part of that? And I think it's a very clever inversion of, like, one of the core tensions of Skinner. But, sorry, I'm talking like I'm the Skinner expert on this podcast. You jump in.
No, it totally is, because I love that one little moment where he's talking to Doggett and Scully's there, and she just grabs his sleeve, and it's so subtle and small, but it's so intense, and I love it. I love it. So, it goes back to all of these things that he told Mulder about Vietnam and all of these things, because he has believed in the paranormal and in these supernatural occurrences, and he's had these own experiences, but he's known all this time he won't get as far if he confesses the truth. And he understands that in a way that I think Mulder understands it, but he doesn't care.
Accept it.
Doesn't accept it. But Skinner, on the opposite side, he understands it, and he's willing to play within the boundaries in order to advance his own agenda, which I really love.
And also the fact that makes him uncomfortable, which is that kind of nice inversion, because so much of the show has been like, can we trust Skinner? And Skinner proving that they can trust him. And so this feels in some way like a betrayal of Mulder after Mulder's gone, which I think like makes it's a kind of Judas thing. It's that kind of like, again, sorry, not to jump back to the discussion we had last year about the Last Temptation of Christ, but the idea that like Judas betraying Christ, was something that hurt Judas as much as Christ, because it had to happen in order for Christ to be crucified and resurrected. And like the idea that Skinner has to betray Mulder here in order to help Mulder, but that is something that hurts Skinner to do. And kind of, again, that sense of discomfort and that sense that nobody here is doing anything that they enjoy doing, but they're doing what they have to do, which I think makes compelling drama, but it's very angsty.
It is.
Like, I'll absolutely own. It is incredibly angsty.
It so is. And speaking of angst, I love that the scene where Scully and Skinner draw guns on each other, and they've been there before. It's not the first time this has happened. And it's a very different dynamic. And then later on,
and
when
you get a Scully it's me.
Yes.
Skinner gets to do a Scully it's me moment, which I really love.
I know. And then later with the alien bounty hunter, and you don't know that it really is the alien or Skinner, because the whole time the alien bounty hunter doesn't talk when he's the bounty hunter. Yeah. But then all of a sudden he's Skinner and he starts talking. So it's like a red herring. You think, oh, well, it can't be Skinner, or it has to be Skinner because he's talking. The alien bounty hunter doesn't talk. He hasn't talked this whole entire episode. But I do like that scene. And just how devastated Scully is at what just happened when she has to essentially shoot Skinner.
And again, very, very angsty. Indeed. Like, it is incredibly angsty.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a chamber piece. Like, that's the thing that I really love about this episode, is that, like, in the past, the mythology episodes have generally been kind of big, bombastic, set-piece driven spectacles, or big continuity payoff stuff. So, like, for example, the train sequence from Nicene 731. We're going to the Arctic and we're building a submarine in like Colony and Endgame, for example. Or, in the seventh season, it's the big two-part of, okay, we're explaining what Samantha is. What I really like about Within and Without is that it feels very intimate and very small and very centralized, and also without any clear resolution, because obviously they don't get Mulder back at the end. So what you do get is this, as you mentioned, all this angst. It's about this kind of character stuff. It doesn't have the big dramatic kind of payoff or spectacle that you expect from this. Even say, in the 4th season, Max, for example, right? Which, like, that is arguably very close to this two-parter in terms of being a story that is largely, emotional. It's largely character-driven. It's largely introspective. It's not necessarily like advancing the overall plot. It doesn't have a clear resolution. But I think that, when you look at Tempest Fugit and you look at Max, the big set piece there is they have like the mid-air abduction sequence, which is this huge spectacle. And like everybody, and they have the plane crash as well, and then the wreckage and all this sort of stuff. Whereas Within and Without really does feel very... And it's weird to say this about, as you point out, an episode where they drive into the middle of the desert. But like it feels really intimate and really small and really focused and really like angsty, for lack of a better word. But where it is about these character dynamics, it is about these characters we know in unfamiliar kind of situations and surroundings. So like the big payoff, as you point out, is Scully shoots somebody who she thinks isn't Skinner, but who might be Skinner. And that's like where the episode kind of like builds to and pays off. And I kind of like, I can get that feeling like an anticlimax to some people watching it, and I understand that. But I kind of love that the show does go small with that, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shifting into different character roles. When they're in the desert, you were talking about the desert and driving through the desert, and it reminded me of, doesn't Scully say the exact same line as Fight the Future when they're driving through the desert? I feel like she said that line where it's like, there's nothing out here, or there's...
Sounds about right.
There's nothing in this direction. I don't know why we're going this way, or something like that.
Yeah, which again is that kind of sense of loneliness and isolation, and the idea that Scully is like not literally and metaphorically in a desert.
Right.
She is kind of in a wilderness with nothing around her, and there is no direction. There's nowhere that she's going, and again, so much angst. But I kind of adore that the show like leans into it, because like you can't ignore the absence of Duchovny. And by the way, I also love that they signed Duchovny on for like 11 episodes of the 8th season, and they blow 2 of them straight away on, like, we're going to strap you naked in a chair and have you scream a bit, and you're going to stand in the desert and hold Gibson praise.
Yeah.
Like, these are our first 2 David Duchovny appearances of the season. 2 of 11. He's only going to be in 9 more episodes. I kind of love that the show just goes, this is a wise investment of our contractual agreement with David Duchovny. And I think it is, maybe we can talk about that, but I kind of love the gumption of it. I love the kind of like the confidence of it. It's like, you're going to stand and stare at Robert Patrick, and you're going to be naked in a chair. That's what we're going to do this week, David. It's like, fine.
And not only that, but like put weird like things on your face and make your face all pulley and weird. Like that couldn't, like, even if it was prosthetics, which I'm sure it was, but just, I don't know. That seems uncomfortable.
Those contract negotiations can be pretty tough.
It's like, this is what you get here, sir.
This is what the lawsuit felt like, David. Yeah. Literally like pulling teeth. But no, like, I do think, though, like, to give it some credit, I do think that is actually important, because I do think it signals to the audience watching at home that, like, Duchovny is going to be part of this season. Like, putting Duchovny in these 2 episodes, even however briefly, even in the context of mostly being the alien bounty hunter wearing Mulder's face, like, I think it signals the audience that, like, we know what we're doing this year, even though, like, they've acknowledged that they were really making it up as they went along. But it does signal that, look, we know that Mulder can't just disappear from the X-Files. Duchovny can't just leave, and we can't just pretend like it's business as usual. And putting Duchovny up front allows them to say to an audience watching in November 2000 that, Duchovny will be back at some point. He is part of the show, even if he's a much lesser part. And I think that it's an approach that works much better than, and again, I'm sorry for all the references we're making to the 9th season, but the choice in Nothing Important Happens Today, where David Duchovny's stunt ass appears before Gillian Anderson, and the show keeps insisting that Mulder is back, but you just missed him by a couple of seconds, and like, despite the fact that Duchovny's not coming back at all. So I think that, like, having Duchovny in this episode and making such a big deal of Mulder's disappearance is crucial, and I think it's a large part of why, for me, the show kind of works or continues to work in the 8th season.
Do you think that's why they say Mulder's name so many times?
Just in case you forgot, in case you thought that we'd forgotten about Mulder. Mulder. Did you say Mulder? No, I said Mulder. You said Mulder. Is Mulder there?
I know
No,
Mulder.
Mulder's not
Mulder
there.
was this. Mulder was that.
Yeah.
I remember
work with
Mulder. I
Mulder.
know Mulder's face.
Yeah. I got a gravestone. It's got Mulder on it. Yeah. You say that's not Mulder? I think that's Mulder. It looked like Mulder. He was the tall guy, brown hair. You mean Mulder? Yeah, Mulder. That guy. But I do feel that like it's necessary to kind of own it, because like the X-Files isn't a show like to pick example. I think like somebody made an argument talking about, I think it was Eeyore, that like television in the 90s used to work like a Broadway show, where like you would have actors rotate in and rotate out over these extended like runs on television. So like I think, you look at Eeyore, for example. Eeyore lost like George Clooney in its 5th season, and it lost Anthony Edwards, I think stayed until its 7th. Like Eric LaSalle left around the same time. Noah Wiley stayed for 11 and left. But the idea was that you could have these, in many TV shows in the 90s, these actors were kind of like interchangeable parts. It's like that kind of question, that riddle about a broom. If you change the handle and you change the head, is it the same broom or is it a completely different broom? But you have like Law and Order could completely rotate through its cast. I think, what was it? Dick Wolf described it as actor proof at one stage. But the idea was that the show is the star, I think, to quote Linus Roach. But I think that with the X-Files understands that like the show isn't really the star. Mulder and Scully are. And I mean, you can point to like arguably as early as the 2nd season when the X-Files are kind of shut down. Like the emotional climax of that arc isn't the reopening of the X-Files at the end of Ascension. It's like Mulder and Scully are reunited in one breath, and next week in Firewalker, we're going to go back to business as usual. Everything is fixed. Or like more profoundly, 2 years earlier, the start of the 6th season, where like the X-Files are shut down, but we're going to continue and follow Mulder and Scully on the show called The X-Files. The X-Files are arguably less important to this show than Mulder and Scully are, because for several weeks at the start of the 6th season, there aren't going to be any X-Files. We're not even going to cut to The Office. We're not interested in what Spender and Foley are doing. We're just going to hang with Mulder and Scully for a little while. And I think that the 8th season is smart enough to understand that the X-Files isn't like Eeyore, it isn't like Law and Order, it isn't something that you can just pop actors in and pop actors out and kind of keep the concept. Just invent a new TV show and call it Fringe. But I think that the show is wise to do that, and I know you're quite right to kind of mock it and to say, yeah, they do mention Mulder's name a lot, and they always, like, the show is very keen to remind you that Mulder's a part of it. They even put Mulder in the opening credits. I love, by the way, that David Duchovny still gets credited first, even though he's barely in these episodes, and even when Mulder doesn't appear in the show, he still appears in the opening credits to remind you that this is a show that used to star David Duchovny as Mulder. But I do think that works. I think that's a large part of why the 8th season works, because they don't pretend that it could work any other way, if that makes sense.
Well,
is that fair?
I think that's interesting, because at the end, the very last part of this episode, you've got Doggett saying, well, I'm assigned to the X-Files. And as X-Files fans, we know that's significant. However, it has a very different feeling, when Mulder and Scully were reinstated to the X-Files together at various
times. It's not fixed. It's not like Doggett being assigned to the X-Files doesn't fix the fundamental problem. And I think like that's something I admire about like this two-parter, is that like at the end of it, it doesn't pretend that things go back to normal. It isn't like, and again, we talked before on the show about how like as much as fans talk about the conspiracy and the mythology, like those episodes, and I think Carter himself may have used the term like Chinese wall existed between the mythology shows and the standalones. Like you have, like, I think DPO is an episode like coming out of obviously Anasazi, coming out of Blessing Way, coming out of Paperclip. DPO is very clear to say, oh, no, this is nothing to do with the government conspiracy. This is just a Monster of the Week episode. Everything that happened in Paperclip was wrapped up in Paperclip. And, like, as the show goes on, its big two-parters tend to, they might leave lingering questions, they might leave lingering mysteries, they might leave threads to be picked up in later episodes. But like you watch Patient X and the Red and the Black, and that is a complete story. You watch, Max and Tempest Fusion and Max, that is a complete story. You watch even Tunguska and Terma, and that is a complete story. They are, might be building blocks to something larger, but like at the end of those episodes, you know that the next episode is going to be a standard Monster of the Week starring Dave Duchovny and Gillian Anderson. What I like about Within and Without is that you watch it and you know that it's not fixed. You watch it and you know that, like, Patience isn't going to be like a case of the week with Doggett and Scully. Like, it's not as if they're going to be like palling around with one another like they've been working together for 7 years. They're not going to be investigating some kid like who can make lightning and like quipping to one another and joking and smiling and drinking coffee together. You know that there's a lot of work left to be done here. And you know that the characters know that this stuff is unresolved. And I think that's what I like about this episode. I also understand that if you don't like it, you're like, well, I'm in for 19 more episodes of this. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I do appreciate, as much as I want Mulder and as much as I have to, side with Mulder and not like Doggett just because he's not Mulder, like...
You don't have to choose. You don't have to choose.
Right.
You can have both.
Right.
Two great tastes that taste great together.
I do appreciate that aspect of Doggett's character, that he is aware that he is not Mulder and that he plays it that way. And, he makes it very clear. I know I'm not Mulder, so... Let's just...
And I think to be fair to Robert Patrick as well, like, you read interviews where he's like, look, I just don't want to get the show cancelled. That's the one thing. I don't want to be the guy who killed the X-Files. Like, I think he says at one point during an early interview in the 8th season, like, I came in, I got this huge opportunity, and I don't want to be the guy who messes it up. And you read interviews again from Anderson, and she's like, I really hope the fans, like, give the guy a break, give him a chance. He's not coming in to replace David. He's not coming in to replace Mulder. And I actually do really like that about Patrick as an actor and Doggett as a character, is that gap does exist. And I think, to be fair, there are reports, you read interviews around the time, that to Patrick's credit, he did do a great deal on set to help liven the atmosphere and to help kind of ease things, because as we pointed out, the 7th season maybe was not the happiest behind the scenes production wise, as tends to be the case when your star is suing your showrunner, or not, suing the broadcast company and naming the showrunner as a co-conspirator. But you have there are reports that on the 7th season, actors were spending less time in their trailers and spending more time together between takes. They were conversing, they were sharing stories, they were enjoying each other's company. And I mean, to be fair, part of that's also down to the fact that I think having lost Duchovny, the show was more cognizant of Anderson and her needs as a mother, for example, at the time, where there are points in the season via Negativa, for example, where Anderson was basically given the week off to go and spend time with her family and with her daughter. And I think that that helps as well. I think that, the show behind the scenes is kind of fixing itself and knitting itself together in a way that I think blends through. I think, and again, maybe this is unfair, maybe this is me just seeing stuff that I want to see there, but it does really seem like people working on the show have a kind of a perhaps more energy this year than they did in the previous season. Maybe that's not fair to say, but I think there's an element of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about Gibson praise, because I think we need to. He's the hybrid. He's the one, right? So
he is indeed
kind of a key part of things.
Yeah, and again, the idea that throughout the show, that the motto of the show is the truth is out there. The truth is out there, and the idea is it's out there in the wilderness, it's out there in space, it's out there with aliens and stuff like that. And I think the big revelation in the end, and I think I'm quoting the episode, I may not be quoting it verbatim, and I apologize to those fans who are quite rightfully going to be yelling at their podcast when I misquote the episode, but I think there's a line about how the truth is in Gibson. The idea that Gibson is the truth, that the truth that Mulder is looking for is embodied in Gibson. And I think that kind of fits with the kind of themes of the larger season where the show is more introspective. The idea, and again, maybe we'll talk about Scully's pregnancy in a moment as well, because that's a big thematic component as well. But like the idea that the truth is, and again, this sounds really corny to go with your angsty, your observation. The 8th season is very angsty. The 8th season is also very corny. The real truth was inside us all along. But I like the idea that they bring back Gibson praise because thematically, like, the truth is inside Gibson.
Right.
So it's the show telling you that the truth is, again, very corny line, the truth is inside us all, but the truth is, what we find in each other maybe, or what we find in people, or what we find when we look in ourselves. It's in our essence. It is within us, so to speak. And I think that's kind of thematically important, even if I'm, not entirely sure about what the show is kind of using Gibson praise for here, where he doesn't seem to have the same level of telepathic ability, obviously, after what happened in the beginning, for example. And, it would be very easy for him to be a bit of, like, continuity stuff, where it's just like, hey, you remember this thing. But I do think that he serves a thematic purpose in kind of, like, making the point about what the show is doing here, perhaps. Is that fair?
I think so. And I think that he gives Scully the opportunity to mesh her scientific mind and thoughts with her, belief in the aliens, because she's the one who has studied Gibson. She knows the truth about him, and she has seen the evidence for herself of what he is. And so I feel that gives her the opportunity to make that shift, because she's the one that believes that he is this hybrid. And then when she has to explain that to Doggett, that's where we see her change. So I think that he's useful for that.
Yeah, we really throw Doggett in the deep end here, don't we? It's like, oh, by the way, he's an alien human hybrid. Also, there's an alien that can change shape and can only be killed by shooting the back of its neck. Also, throat ripping. This is a pretty. If you look at this from, like, I know this is Scully's story and the show is centered around Scully, but if you look at, like, this two-parter from Doggett's perspective, can you imagine Doggett coming, like, having a beer with a mate at the end of Without, and it's like, so, I did some, mail fraud cases this week. We caught a case of identity theft. What'd you get up to, John? What was your week like?
Well, Bob.
Yeah, let me tell you.
Yeah, they really throw him into the deep end, don't they? It's like, welcome to the X-Files.
Yeah, you'll find your way. You'll figure it out.
Aliens are real. What else do you need to know? Green blood that will poison you, and...
Is it patient? Like, one of the things I do love about it is that, like, the show doesn't apologize for that. Like, the show treats that hazing of Doggett as, like, a necessary part of his character growth, which is smart. It, like, there's no angst about Doggett. The show, like, okay, there is angst obviously when you get to stuff like Invocation, but there's no angst around, like, Doggett being like, man, this X-Files stuff is weird. It's just like, no, it's part of the job. Is it like Patience, or is it Roadrunners, where, like, it's revealed that Doggett just, like, read all the X-Files over a long weekend?
Yeah.
And it's just like, no, that's just part of the job,
right?
Like, that's just what you do now. That's like, that's the bare minimum for what you're going to be asked to do.
Right. And actually, I actually really like Patience. I know a lot of people don't, but I like that episode. It's very scary and effective. But yeah. So Gibson, and speaking of angst,
what a segue.
How deeply gut-wrenching is it when he's sitting there and he's looking and he knows the spaceship is there and he can hear Mulder and he knows that Mulder is there. You just can't see him. And he's like, he's closer than you think. And it's like, Gibson, just tell her. He's right there. Like, why? Why are you being so vague about this? He's not closer than you think. He's right there. Just tell her.
I mean, you've seen the end, right? Again, like, Gibson, the starting point of the end, the opening, like, teaser sequence is Gibson, like, finds out that there's a sniper up in the rafters about to shoot him, and instead of, I don't know, telling somebody or leaving the room, he instead manipulates his opponent into getting shot instead of him. And then, like, later on you have, like, the sequence with, obviously, with Foley and with Scully, where he's like, is it to Scully where he says he loves one of you? And it's like, oh, it would be or is it to Mulder where he says one of the two of them loves you? And it's just this mind games from this, like, prepubescent kid who's obviously, like, with his psychic ability just figured out he can do whatever he wants. Right. And he could just play these games with these adults around him and just kind of mentally torture them, where it's like, oh, he's close. Like, he's like the Riddler. One of them loves you, Mulder. I'm not going to tell you which one. Oh, he's closer than you think, Scully. I'm just not going to tell you where he is.
But if you imagine being able to hear everyone's thoughts and essentially know everything, that's got to be its own, like, mind. And as a kid, like, that's a lot to handle. And I feel like he understands the responsibility that he carries because, you know, everything that he knows can change the future and he can have a profound effect on things. But it reminds me a lot of this character in the Dresden Files. There's a little girl who is called the Archive, and she has all of the knowledge of everything. All of human history she knows in her head. And she's this little kid, and it's like her responsibility to contain that information, but not to use it. And I think that that's, you know, equivalent to Gibson, that maybe he contains all this information, but he feels like he is not allowed to use it to affect things. Yeah. You know,
I mean, he is also a kid as well. Yeah. Is the thing that's really interesting, like because it's even beyond that, there's also like a level of emotional intelligence that you don't have as a kid. He, as you point out, he has access to all this stuff, but he doesn't necessarily understand how to use it. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a problem that he doesn't know how to communicate like this stuff that he knows to adults, given that, you know, both in the world of the X-Files and in the world of, like, being an adult, adults don't always know how to communicate clearly to one another as well. So, like, I don't really have a problem with, like, the fact that Gibson prays, if he were maybe a bit more open, could have solved a lot of problems on the show, because I feel like that's, as you point out, that's a lot to heap on a kid.
It is.
A lot of responsibility, and not necessarily using it in the best way isn't a criticism because he's a kid. Particularly when you hit teenage years. Yes, as a former teenager, I can tell you there's a lot of learning.
Yeah, and just in that part where Mulder is on the ship and he's just yelling for Scully. Just.
I mean, come on, again, this is the Carter thing about chaste romance, where Carter, like, is arguably better at writing Mulder and Scully pining for each other than he is writing Mulder and Scully as two adults in a healthy relationship with one another. Like, I feel like, you know, there is a sense of Carter playing to his strengths here, where, like, unrequited love or separated love or characters who cannot be together because one of them has been abducted and is being tortured by aliens, kind of like that's something that I think plays to Carter's strengths as a writer, because, like, you know, the Mulder-Scully relationship, so much of that is tension, and I love that the 8th season just kind of leans into that, where it's like, yeah, but what if they really couldn't be together for that long? What if they were really separated from one another? What if, like, that was the big emotional arc of the season? And I think that, like, for all the fair criticism that Carter receives of, like, how he maybe doesn't write, say, the relationship between Mulder and Scully particularly convincingly when they are actually in a relationship, I do think that Carter writes that sense of, like, longing, desperation, loneliness really, really well. And I like, we joke about how angsty it is, but I do find myself a little moved by it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Scully's pregnancy. We need to cover that, right?
We do. And again, this is one of the things where, like, I completely understand people who have issues with the 8th season because of, like, the issues stemming from Scully's pregnancy. Particularly when we get to, you know, the fact that it leads to my baby in the 9th season, which is not a very flattering way of treating Scully as a character. And, you know, and again, there is this historical thing, and, like, I'll put my hands up and I'll say, like, I'm quite critical of certain choices the show makes around the 4th or 5th season with Scully, where early on, having decided that Scully maybe, like, having a child is not something Scully wanted, Scully then gets put through this emotional ringer where obviously she is left unable to conceive following her abduction, and then she's kind of put through this ringer where, like, it seems like everything that she wants is a child. She wants to be a mother more than anything. And the kind of, you know, gender essentialism of that, where it often feels like, particularly on the X-Files where the writer's room was predominantly male, it was quite reductive of Scully, or at least I thought it was quite reductive of Scully, the way in which the show in its 4th and 5th season will constantly kind of come back to and really lean into the idea that, Scully desperately wants to be a mother, and this is one of the biggest defining motivations for her as a character in terms of mythology, particularly when you didn't really have anything comparable happening with Mulder, where Mulder didn't have a similar urge to be a father or want to be a father or a relationship to children. I get that criticism, and I completely understand for some fans that you reach the 8th season, and the 8th season is entirely about Scully becoming a mother in a literal sense, in that it's the arc of the season. And again, I'm kind of cognizant of spoilers here, but let's just say that despite what Within and Without seem to be setting up, maybe, hypothetically, without spoilers, the culmination of the season isn't Mulder's return, but perhaps it's the birth of the baby. So you could argue the big arc of the 8th season is more about Scully's pregnancy even than it is about Mulder's absence. Perhaps, he says, not wanting to spoil it for people who haven't seen it. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But I get the criticism that this maybe reduces Scully as a character, that this is gender essentialist, that again, this is a show that is being written mainly by men at this point in its run, and that is something that fans of the character do not like, or some fans of the characters do not like, and I think that's an entirely legitimate reaction to have to the season. I think it's a fair criticism to make, and I'm not going to dispute it in any way, shape, or form. I do think, however, that the show by this point has established this as a characteristic of Scully, going back to things like A Christmas Carol and Emily, for example, going back to Memento Mori, for example, that this is a large part of who Scully is on the show at this moment in time. And I think the show, with that starting constraint and with that understanding, handles it relatively well, I think, personally, and I say that as a man who has no authority to speak with any authority on the matter. So I will put my hands up and say that I'm probably wrong here. But I do... One of the things that I really respond to in the season is its treatment of body horror. And so much of the show in the 8th season, and again, you talked about how... You mentioned specifically Patience is a very dark, very scary episode. The show becomes a lot more graphic and a lot more unsettling. And, there are several points in the show where that horror is explicitly likened to birth. So, for example, Badla, one of the great visuals in Badla is a hand bursting from a stomach, which is a very evocative pregnancy image. You have characters later in the season who wash meat off themselves as if being reborn. Here in Within and Without, the trauma that Mulder is experiencing is explicitly paralleled with Scully's pregnancy. The opening scene of Within, you initially think that that's Scully's baby that she's seeing. It's like amniotic fluid. It's what looks like an umbilical cord, and then you realize it's Mulder. The umbilical cord is pulled out of his mouth, and he turns out to be kind of moist. The fact that the sequence that we're watching is very explicitly graphic body horror. Mulder is penetrated with a drill in The Nightmare in Within, and he is cut open in his torso with a rotating saw in Without. Even here you have body horror that is more explicitly graphic, I would argue, than the show has done since maybe Sanguinarium and maybe Home in the 4th season. So things like the throat ripping, which is surprisingly graphic for a show airing on network television. And then, not only is that graphic, but, you have the sequence where, Thea recognizes that Crane is the bounty hunter because his hand is literally dripping with blood. You have, the moment where Scully shoots Skinner, and he turns into the alien bounty hunter, and he dissolves, and that feels arguably more graphic than what we've seen with the alien bounty hunter dissolving in previous episodes as well. And obviously there are parallels with things body horror and pregnancy when you get to episodes like Roadrunner, which is about having this thing inside of you that you don't understand and you don't want there and you don't know what you're going to do. And I think that again, this is the show's theme this season, is that the truth isn't necessarily outside, but is within us. And again, this is one of the things that maybe this isn't the time to talk about it on the second episode of the 8th season, but I think that if you were maybe making a criticism of the 8th season of the X-Files, you could argue that it's a point at which the show maybe becomes a little bit reactionary, where it becomes maybe, we mentioned the fact that like it's no longer about, say, hybridization. It's no longer about the idea of mingling and blending. It's instead about like what's inside and what's outside. But I think that, the idea of the pregnancy being inside Scully and the idea that that is the X-File that drives the season. I mean, even look at the opening credit sequence where you have the fetus eclipsed by the world, as if to suggest that that pregnancy is the whole world of the X-Files now. You have that idea of like Mulder falling into Scully's eye, which is, not to be too graphic for an X-Cast podcast, but is a fairly evocative image when it comes to suggesting things like fertilization, perhaps. And you have, and again, I would argue, and this is something where I will freely concede I am going out on a limb, and I may be wrong, and people who are yelling at their podcast for me to shut up are entirely right. But I would argue that one of the central thematic horrors of the... Sarah's like, this is going to be good. One of the central thematic horrors of the 8th season is like Scully's fear that she might have to do this alone, that she might end up a single mother, that she might have to raise this child without his father. Now, to be clear, I think the show isn't being judgmental there. I think one of the smarter things that happens later in the season, particularly in the episode 3 Words, and like I love that so much of the titles of the show in this season are like clever wordplay, where like without is both like outside Scully and without Mulder. But like 3 Words is both the central tension of 3 Words are like which 3 words are more important to Mulder: trust no one or I love you to Scully. And like the show is basically saying, Mulder, you need to choose between those 3 words, those sets of 3 words. Later in the season, it becomes very clear that Scully can do this by herself. She is well capable of doing this by herself. She is strong enough to do it alone. She doesn't want to force Mulder to do it with her. She doesn't want Mulder to feel obligated to do it with her. One of the most important arcs, I would argue, in the 8th season is the idea of Scully wanting Mulder to be a person who wants to do this with her. Like, she doesn't want Mulder to do this out of a sense of obligation. She wants him to become a father. She wants him to be her partner because that's what he wants to do. So the show isn't shaming Scully. It isn't. I don't think it's shaming Scully. I don't think it's arguing that she would be lesser if she did it by herself. But I do think the show understands that Scully is understandably and palpably and relatably and fundamentally terrified that she is going to have to do this thing by herself. And I think that's a wonderfully delicate balance for the 8th season, to understand that she can, but to understand that doing it without Mulder, doing it without the person that she loves, doing it, that is an existential nightmare. That is the real horror of the season as a whole. And maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm being too generous. Maybe I'm kind of pulling stuff out of various parts of my anatomy. But that's what I really respond to emotionally in the season, is that like all that body horror, all that darkness, all that violence, all that nightmarish imagery is tied up in something fundamentally human, emotional, and relatable, which is the idea that Scully is going through this incredible thing, and she's facing the prospect that she might have to do it by herself, and that is the most scary thing in the world.
It is,
and that's what I love about the season.
Yeah,
I think, and that's what I love about Scully.
I definitely agree with that. I think it's a very profound, observation, because I do feel like there are things that they do get right, especially in Within, where she's just standing there and staring at herself in the mirror, and that's very relatable. I can say, having given birth twice, I do appreciate her journey in that episode, and when she, just the very human aspects of it that we get to see from her. I like that they put that in, and slowed down enough to pay attention to those things and to put those things in. I think makes a huge difference. And you're right that yes, definitely she doesn't want to have this baby alone. She doesn't want to do this without Mulder. And I think that, that's established even in Fight the Future. She doesn't want to do any of it without Mulder. I mean, baby or no baby, she doesn't want to do this journey without Mulder because they're partners and they love each other. Plain and simple. I think that's what it boils down to, really.
There are criticisms, I think, to be made of the show's 8th season that it can be read in ways that are reactive or reactionary, and I think maybe we'll get to those, if you have me back later in the season, if I haven't burnt all my bridges after this episode. I think that the show is cognizant of the fact that she can do it by herself. Mm-hmm. Like, there's never any doubt. There's never any doubt that Scully is strong enough to do it by herself. But I think that, like, the balance is in saying that still scares her. Like, it's a very delicate balance to strike where it never feels like it belittles Scully. It never feels like it diminishes her, that she wants Mulder to do it with her, because the show is always like, she can do it by herself if she needs to, but she shouldn't need to, and it's okay for her to want not to.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Or anything else we missed? I feel like we covered everything.
I feel like we talked about absolutely everything. I do love Kirsch. I love Kirsch so much. That's the only other note that I have. I just have the word Kirsch written and circled in my notes. I actually do really love Kirsch in the kind of 6th and 8th seasons because he's such an asshole. He is such a remarkably terrible human being. And Pickens is really, really good in the role. And I do like that you get a sense that, like, he's one of the rare major characters in the show who doesn't really have, like, an ideological stance. Like, it's not like he's motivated by anything involving the colonists or the conspiracy, or at least it doesn't seem that way now at the moment. Now, you will find out, the 9th season is his own bag of cats. But, like, here it really just comes across that Kirsch is basically, no, he just wants to be director of the FBI. And all this stuff involving, like, bounty hunters and alien human hybrids is really just a bit of a pain for him, unless it helps him get rid of a potential, political rival by just, like, bagging Doggett, like, weighing Doggett down with all this nonsense. I kind of love that it's just this inside baseball politics nonsense. It's not some vast conspiracy. It's not some cigarette-smoking man pulling the strings. It's just Kirsch going, no, you know what? I just want a bigger office at the end of this. I kind of like that that's playing out in the background of all of this as well.
It's a good contrast between him and Skinner, because Skinner knows how to play the game, but he's walking the line, and Kirsch is just like, who cares? I just want to climb a ladder.
Yeah, it's like, because that's the thing. Like, I think we've remarked on this before. Like, imagining, like, what Skinner's week looks like, where, like, all the stuff he has to do on top of dealing with Mulder and Scully, and how much of, like, Mulder barging into his office, like, ruins his day because he's now got to reschedule all the meetings. I kind of look at, like, the Kirsch is the opposite of that, where it's just like, no, I don't really care about the crazy stuff that goes down in the basement. It's just you handle that. That's your business. But that's just a nice place to send somebody who I don't want to have to worry about chasing me up the ladder.
Exactly. It's hilarious. Yeah. Shall we dive into the mailbag and see what some of the listeners have to say?
Yes.
Let's do it.
I am ready. My body is ready.
All right. Chris Henry says, great episode, great middle episode of the 3-parter. Love Robert Patrick's introduction. Only downside is Skinner's desert attire. Far too much beige and yellow. And then Lisa says after that, definitely more of a winter than a summer.
What, as our, like, Skinnerologist on this podcast, what do you make of Skinner's
I don't love the yellow. I don't think it, like, really goes well with his complexion. I think they should have chosen a blue, like a nice, Oxford blue would have been great. But I do appreciate the rolled up sleeves and the open collar. We're gonna. It
does look like he could do some, like, archaeology afterwards.
Exactly.
To be fair, it does have that kind of look to it.
Like he's out there to look for dinosaurs, and they're gonna go to Jurassic Park. yeah. Like, there's like a leather hat or something in one of the cars that he's ready to break out when the mood looks a bit lighter. When things seem just a little bit. When Scully looks like she's ready to smile, he's got his little kind of, like, kit. He's got a leather bag as well, leather satchel. I'm gonna need a water.
Get the fan art. Yeah, get the fan art there.
Go drink some water for a second. I'll be right back. Okay. Tony.
I didn't mention the whip.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's going on my fanfic list. Okay, Tony says, without benefits from all of the necessary setup being out of the way to tell much more of a propulsive cat and mouse story, even if the whole thing is a bit absurd. I don't imagine any script in the entire series said Mulder's name more than this episode. I always enjoy Scully's awkward admittance that the alien bounty hunter is indeed an alien. That feels like the first big step of her character arc this season.
Now all Scully needs to do is explain how he's actually a bounty hunter. That's always been my problem with the alien bounty hunter as a character, is that I don't really buy that he's a bounty hunter. I absolutely buy he's an alien. He's definitely an alien. But he really seems more like an alien cop, really, than a bounty hunter. He doesn't seem like a freelancer. It doesn't seem like he's sitting at his desk and he gets his little, like, APB out and he's like, Dog the bounty hunter. He's like, yeah, let's do this stuff. He seems like a contractor, rather than a bounty hunter. The alien contractor.
Yeah, he's like a contract for hire guy. Yeah, totally. He just goes where they tell him to go and gets paid for it, right? And then Tony says the last appearance of the alien bounty hunter here too, which was a bit of a shame given how inauspicious it is. But the episode overall works well to finish Within's establishment of the new season paradigm. So yeah, the part where the alien bounty hunter is standing there just looking down at Mulder, and that's how it's just I don't know what to make of it. I really, like, every time I'm just like, what?
Really? I love that kind of shot where the camera kind of pans around, though. Like, I love, and again, the special effects, and it just looks so casual. Again, Manor is a fantastic director. But I do like that thing where it's the last appearance of the bounty hunter, because like that sequence does feel like it's like, oh, some stuff's gonna go down with the alien bounty hunter. It's like, no, he is never appearing again. And I mean, like, as the show goes on, we'll maybe talk, like, as the season goes on, we'll talk about like the 8th season shedding the mythology, like so much dead skin in a shower somewhere, perhaps in a later episode. But I do think, yeah, it is rather inauspicious that this is the last appearance of this character, who is arguably iconic. Like, he's one of the actors that I think of when I think of the show. I cheered when I watched The Tragedy of Macbeth and Brian Thompson shows up as one of the murderers. And I was like, yeah, there he is. So it does feel a bit underwhelming that this is, the last time that we are going to see this part of the mythology.
So that's where the alien bounty hunter went. He went to Macbeth.
Yeah, he went to, 14th century Scotland, 15th century Scotland?
To the Scottish play. All right, Chris Knowles says, phenomenal episode all around. After the envelope got pushed a bit too far with the X-Files light, it was quite refreshing and weirdly disorienting to get back to hardcore old-school X-Files. Robert Patrick hit the ground running and brought a real sense of urgency back to the series after a dreamy and flabby season 7. Tight plot, crisp dialogue, and top-flight direction. You could tell Kim Manners was still jonesing hard on The Insider. In short, great start to a great season, if only they let it end with existence.
I mean, I do feel the need to kind of push back just myself, just in case people are worried that my love of the 8th season is a rejection of like the X-Files light or the 6th and 7th seasons. I love the really light romantic comedy vibes of the early 6th season. I think they work remarkably well. I do also like the darkness here. I don't think that it's an either or.
Right.
Would be kind of the only thing that I would say. I think the X-Files, again, like, you don't have to choose between Doggett and Mulder, Sarah. You can have both.
Agreed.
Two tastes that taste great together. You can have dark and scary 8th season X-Files and kind of light, fluffy romantic comedy 6th season X-Files. It's not one or the other.
Exactly.
Just throw that idea.
It's the beauty of the X-Files. You have the smorgasbord you can pick and choose from, should you so desire.
It's more of a serving menu, really. Tasting menu.
Tasting menu. I'll take a little bit of the the sugar.
Take a little bit of the light body horror there.
Yeah. Give me some of Give me some of the shipper moments over existentialism over here, and some body
Do you have
horror.
A butt-dwelling Indian faker there? Oh, no, never mind.
Yeah, and I do agree, like, as someone who unabashedly adores the X-Files light. don't particularly care for that moniker, but here we are.
I was gonna ask that, like, if I call it the X, as somebody who likes that era, if I call it the X-Files light, is that insulting? That's what I was wondering.
I don't love it.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know what else to call it. There's really nothing else to call it. So like I've accepted
the 6th season.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there you go. Like the 6th season. It's not, because it just comes with so many connotations that I think aren't really fair, you know. And the 6th season is my favorite season. It's the one that I rewatch the most. So there are the most number of episodes in season 6 that I rewatch on a regular basis.
And I would argue the show probably, outside of two-parters, never did like 2 episodes back to back as good as Drive and Triangle.
Right.
I think those are near perfect episodes of television, and it's astounding that the show was like, yeah, let's just hit one of them out and then do the next one.
They're so
like,
good.
So no, they are fantastic, and like so, and I would argue sorely underrated. Like Triangle is. Sorry, now we are talking about Triangle for an hour and a half. But no, I do think that like Triangle is a masterpiece of just television production, because it manages to figure out like what Hitchcock did with Rope couldn't work because you could only film 10 minutes before you needed to change film canisters. That works perfectly on television because you have television acts and ad breaks. Mm-hmm. So it like only time anybody's ever going to say this, and I desperately hope that like this isn't something I get quoted on because I'll be kind of embarrassed by it, but I'm not going to say Chris Carter is better than Alfred Hitchcock, but I am kind of saying that Chris Carter is better than Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah I mean, you need to talk to Carl about that probably.
Fair. I don't want to talk. Don't tell Carl I said that. I will never hear the end of it.
It's fine. He doesn't listen to this show. It's fine.
Not involved at all. He's just casually acquainted with it.
Okay, so Ellie Jean says, I really love all the cat and mouse tension that's been building since Within. The MVP of this episode is Doggett, who shows his true colors. Desperate not to get sucked into politics, steadfast in his responsibility to find Mulder, and respectful enough to Scully to shield her and honor her privacy when she breaks down at the end. Plus, he gives her a card and a cute message at the end. Obviously, Mulder is Mulder, and we love him, but Doggett is amazing. Doggett fan.
Yeah, I'm a Doggett fan too, and I feel like I deserve some sort of like award or nice card from Agent Doggett, possibly, perhaps, to acknowledge, I didn't turn this into the Doggett cast, but I love how fundamentally decent Doggett is. Like things like you mentioned, kind of shielding Scully's privacy, but things even like when that moment with Skinner where Scully asks him not to put it in the report, and his response is, "It's not going to help me find Mulder. Why would I even bother doing that?" Like I think the show does a really good job of understanding. A, fans are going to be antagonistic towards Doggett just because he's not Mulder, but also B, he's a fundamentally decent person from the outset. And I think that those two things are hugely important, and they are why I love this part of the show, but also why I love like the character of Doggett.
Yeah.
Also angst. Doggett has a lot of angst.
He does.
And that's very much in the milieu of the 8th season, as you kind of suggested.
Yeah.
This is X-Files angst to complement X-Files light.
Yeah. Well, I do like that his character is very kind of rugged, and he's a former NYPD cop. He's a former, Marine. Yeah. And so he does bring that rugged aspect, but he's also, the character of Doggett. He has his own roles, and he is classy and, a gentleman sometimes.
Sweetheart.
Yeah. So, as a character, I do appreciate him.
I feel like that's a victory. I'm going to take that as a victory. And I convince Sarah to like the 8th season of the X-Files. The baby steps, little steps. We'll get there eventually.
Yes. Andrew says we'll get there. We're going to see how it took. We're on episode,
that was a very diplomatic answer, Sarah.
We're on episode 2, Darren. Let's give it a minute. We'll see how it goes. Baby steps. All right, Andrew says, after an excellent continuation of the Requiem story in Within, Without is a disappointing episode, mostly because the FBI agents stand around the school doing nothing for most of the story. Perhaps it's a way to show that Doggett's conventional way of investigation is not useful when it comes to investigating X-Files cases. But it's not entertaining, and it's unbelievable that these highly trained agents would simply wait around for Mulder to turn up again. That said, the climax is great, as is the predictable but necessary turn of events for Doggett at the conclusion. I also enjoy Scully following and finding Gibson in the desert, even if it drags on a little longer than it needs to. At best, it's a 6 out of 10 episode for me. I feel...
All right, Andrew.
I have thoughts that television has ruined the impression of law enforcement for most people. Because I feel like there is a lot of waiting, and there is a lot of sitting and waiting in real law enforcement. You have to wait for test results on TV. You do not. They magically get test results back so quickly, and yet in actual real life, that is not a thing.
I mean, that's the famous CSI effect, like, which is one of those things that I absolutely love, where, like, and again, this is something like a really boring Darren fact. I studied law. Like, one of the things that we would note in like law and in criminal law was that it's really easy now to turn a jury against like police detectives simply by like referencing CSI. So you get and again, this is something that's really terrible. You should not do this. This is not moral or ethical in any way sense. I'm not endorsing this practice, but it like there are arguments that like if you're defending somebody and you have a police officer on the stand, what you do is you ask them like questions like, so you have so you say you caught my client like holding the TV outside a broken window. And it's like, yes, I did. So do you have any DNA linking the suspect to the TV? It's like, no, we found him holding the TV. We arrested him on site. We have his fingerprints. But you don't have any DNA. Do you run any DNA tests on the television? It's like, no. Any skin cells? Any matching hair fibers? It's like, no, we didn't do that because that costs money and takes time. We saw him holding the television. We have the fingerprints and we have photos of it. It's like, so you're telling me you don't have any forensic evidence that connects my client to the crime? And apparently that works remarkably well on juries because they've been, as you said, conditioned to believe that every single case will get all of this forensic treatment, even when it is completely unnecessary, even when it is like completely secondary and pointless, when so much of, as you point out, law enforcement is sitting around waiting, watching, observing, and documenting.
Right.
I do also like what are the agents supposed to do when they're looking for Mulder in the school? What else are they supposed to do except stand around and wait? Like what other leads are they chasing there? Yeah, that's kind of my question.
Yeah, and I mean, literally the reason I became a writer instead of a forensic anthropologist, I wanted to be Scully. I wanted to be Scully when I grew up, and that was my plan. And then I went to my first anthropology class to begin this career as a forensic anthropologist. And the first thing the professor said was, you don't do a lot of forensic anthropology, you do a lot of paperwork. It's like 90% of it is paperwork, and you don't get what you think it's not what you think it is. This is few and far. The bodies come few and far between. They don't pile up every week. You're not investigating these interesting, cases every week. You're researching a lot, and you're doing a lot of paperwork in an office at a desk. And sometimes you go testify in court. And I was like, I'm out. That's it. I'm done. I'm going to write. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write about the fun stuff. This is,
I do love the idea of raising your hand and going, sir, what are the odds of finding a butt-dwelling Indian faker? And it's like, you don't even want to know.
Like, so you mean I'm not going to be discovering alien bodies every week? And it's like, no. Okay, well, never mind. This is not the career for me.
Well, and again, that's the kind of structure and demand of television, where you have all these shows that have to churn out episodes weekly where interesting and insane things happen. So you have to kind of push the boundaries of what is possible in law enforcement. And again, same argument we made about like movies as well, the presentation, like how, like what people think police officers can do without getting like legal clearance for it is also insane. Like the amount of, as you point out, paperwork involved in getting a warrant, the amount of like, just cause you have to show as well, and all this sort of stuff. It's insane, and it's very different from how law enforcement is. That said, I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to suggest that like maybe Carter wasn't trying to capture an accurate reflection of law enforcement without. I think it just works thematically. I think it works because the whole point is that like all they can do is sit and wait. All they have to do is kind of be useless. There is nothing that anybody can do that will resolve this situation, which I think is kind of, again, very angsty.
Yes.
Very angsty season of television. But I think for me, while understanding Andrew's response to it, it works for me because of that. Because it's like, there is nothing. We got to the school in the desert. We found the kid. What now?
Right.
Like, what happens now?
Yeah.
What's the purpose? What's the plan? What's the end game here? It's not like they can't even go canvassing houses because they're in the middle of the desert.
It's just this random school out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. And apparently a hospital. There's a hospital nearby as well.
And it did make me wonder, in the days of no GPS and no Google, how they found that hospital out in the middle of the desert. Was it on the map?
It's not as if there were it's not as if there were many other hospitals. It's like, no, you want to bring him to, like, South Central, sort of like East Western Desert Hospital. That's where you want to bring him. Slightly west of center. Middle of nowhere.
Exactly. All right, Darren, as always, it has been a great pleasure to hang out with you and to talk about the X-Files. And I feel much more optimistic about this season. So I feel like this is going to be an adventure for all of us, and I'm here for it.
I feel sorry that I've kind of held you hostage while I rant about how great the season is.
I appreciate it because it's been very enlightening, and it's been fun. It's always fun talking to you. So
it is. Always fun talking to me, naturally. No, I mean, it's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it as well, actually.
All right. Do you have anything going on that you'd like to share with us, or?
Okay, so let's throw this out there and let's add some ambiguity and maybe some nice parallels to the 8th season of the show. My podcast partner, Andrew Quinn, is getting married in April, and I am very delighted and very excited for him. We are trying to bank episodes of our podcast together, The 250, which is a podcast that looks at the IMDb's top 250 and bottom 100 movies of all time, ahead of time. So as we are recording this, I have no idea if there are new episodes of the podcast out, or if we've simply kind of called it a day like reasonable grown-up men who have like adult responsibilities and said there are more important things, including Andrew's wedding. So I don't know if there are new episodes there, but you can check them out and see if they are. We also have a back catalogue of kind of episodes where we talk about those movies kind of at length. We talk about one every week. It's good fun. I really enjoy it. If you're looking for more me in your life, because for some reason me talking for, at this stage, almost an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes about the X-Files isn't enough for you. You can find me at Darren_Mooney on Twitter. Come shout at me, come yell about me stuff, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm right, tell me that my hair is bad, whatever works, it's all good. And I write at The Escapist, at Escapist Magazine, The Escapist Online, where I do twice weekly columns in the frame. Looking at pop culture, both new and old, retro and modern, and I'm really kind of proud of those. I hope I do good work there, but people seem to like them as well. And I do film reviews there as well, so you can find me there if you want as well. Also, if this is coming out in April, and you really, really, really like my contribution here, and you want to do me a solid, and I will really appreciate it, and I will name my firstborn children after you. Promise is not legally binding. But I have a new book coming out, which is part of the Black Archive. It is a series of books looking at the production and the meaning and the background and the themes of individual stories from the history of the British television show Doctor Who. I'm covering Kill the Moon, which is a controversial episode in the 8th season. If you do want to support me, or if you like Doctor Who, or if you love Kill the Moon, if you want to order a copy of that book, it is available. You can pre-order from Amazon or from other booksellers at the moment, or even just email your local library and ask them to get it into stock for you, because they have an entire budget for that. So yeah, that's where you can find me. That's what I'm at. If you have more need for me in your life, apparently. But thank you. Cheers.
Excellent, Darren. And you can always find the Xcast on Twitter at the X_cast, and on our Facebook group, the X-Files Basement, the Xcast Podcast Fan Group, and on Instagram, the Xcast Pod. And you can find me, Sarah, at Twitter. I'm Sarah L. Blair, and on Instagram, I'm author.sarah.blair. So we appreciate you joining us this week, and until next time, always remember, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This.
Academy Watch, a prestige film podcast.
A lot of these other characters that are not human have these bizarre names, non-Anglo names. And then we have Paul.
I mean, I kind of wanted a Brian or a Gary to rock up next to him as well.
Yeah, like a Gary, like a real like Scouse guy from.
I was about to do a Scouse accent, but then I thought better of it.
Yeah, let's leave the Scouse. We've already offended the Pauls. Let's leave the Garys alone.
Pick a disc.
Everyone was sort of caught up in the cowboyness of the post 9/11 world. Like to an extent, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, George W. Bush basically took on the role of John Wayne. He was like, I'm going to find them and I'm going to catch them and I'm going to put them to justice, that sort of thing. And I think for a long while that had kind of been accepted, and that was, okay, you can lead us forward, you know what you're doing. And then, some other things began happening and other wheels started turning, and that's where I think this album managed to land. Was there were a load of people that were thinking about, is this right? Should we be doing this? And it kind of validated that school of thought because it said it in such an eloquent way, and it's very, very pointed at its administrations and its message of anti-war, not necessarily anti-this war, but anti-all wars.
Right in the childhood.
There's other boy bands include the likes of McFly. McFly was a big one.
I remember McFly.
McFly, Busted.
McFly was shit busted.
Oh, that's a controversial.
I could name 5 or 8. Well, 3 or 4.
Here we go, because I'm a big Busted and McFly
I could name
fan.
3 or 4 Busted songs.
Go
I
on.
could name you no McFly songs.
Name me some Busted.
Year 3000.
Yeah.
Shit me, I'm sure I know more than Year 3000.
Glad I crashed the wedding.
Yeah, that one.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.